welcome to another episode of the Discussion Group. The ambition for this program is to have a thoughtful conversation on a variety of subjects. Today's topic is climate crisis. We'll be discussing the very serious situation our civilization now faces from rapidly advancing and destructive climate change as the result of the burning of fossil fuels by human beings. We'll also be examining the extremely urgent need for action by governments, communities, and individuals to address this existential emergency. Let me welcome the panelists. I know this isn't the happiest of topics to discuss, but I do appreciate you guys being here today.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to jump right into a first clip that gives a description of what the greenhouse effect is. Essentially, power plants and automobiles burn fossil fuel, which release emissions. Those emissions are carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that traps in radiant heat from the sun and warms up the planet. The second part of the clip goes into the serious situation that we now find ourselves in because of it. Both portions of this clip you're about to see are from science programs. One is from Cosmos, the other one is from the BBC Climate Change, the Facts. So we'll jump into the clip, and then we come back, we can start our discussion. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's take a look.
Incoming light from the sun hits the surface. The Earth absorbs much of that energy, which heats the planet up and makes the surface glow in infrared light. But the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere absorbs most of that outgoing heat radiation, sending much of it right back to the surface. This makes the planet even warmer. That's all there is to the greenhouse effect. It's basic physics, just bookkeeping of the energy flow. There's nothing controversial about it. If we didn't have any carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, the Earth would just be a great big snowball, and we wouldn't be here. So a little greenhouse effect is a good thing, but a big one can destabilize the climate and wreck our way of life.
Before we started to burn coal, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. It's now over 400 parts per million. And the planet gets warmer and warmer.
We are seeing the impacts of climate change now play out in real time. They're no longer subtle.
We're not just talking about an inconvenience. We're talking about people's lives, their livelihoods, and their communities being damaged.
Standing here in the English countryside, it may not seem obvious, but we are facing a man-made disaster on a global scale. In the 20 years since I first started talking about the impact of climate change on our world, conditions have changed far faster than I ever imagined.
Join the dots. It's happening. It's happening in your world. It's happening in my world. And let's be very clear about this. It is going to get much worse.
It may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we have not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies.
We're on course to go through 1.5 degrees in just a few decades' time, and the models differ slightly as to exactly when. And not long after that, we're on a trajectory to go through 2 degrees.
It really becomes difficult to see at such levels of warming how we're going to maintain our agriculture such that the population of the world can actually feed itself.
And ensuring people have access to clean, safe drinking water will become much more difficult.
We're running out of time, but there is still hope.
It's actually not that complicated. We need to shift our energy system away from fossil fuels that produce greenhouse gases and towards renewable energies that don't.
We still have time to turn everything around, to pull the emergency brake and to take action. But that short period of time isn't going to last for long.
We now stand at a unique point in our planet's history, one where we must all share responsibility, both for our present well-being and for the future of life on Earth.
Okay, that's kind of sobering. And I got to be honest with you, preparing for this program, I was doing research, and it can get rather depressing. I mean, some of the research, some of the data is out there that actually shows on one end of the spectrum, human beings going extinct in our children's lifetime. I know that sounds alarmist, but the fact that it's even in the consideration of scientific data on the spectrum, I mean, that should just wake up every person on the planet.
Absolutely.
What do you think? Do we have the wherewithal
to enact some change? Yeah, I guess so. You talk about climate change, just kind of back to the initial problem. I think it's even, like you said, sobering. But it's, you start to do these things. These thought experiments around what's going to happen, right? So people, whether it's extinction or just like dramatic change in human society and civilization, right? And I think you have to ask yourself when that's right, what we're talking about. Is that acceptable, right? Because that's what we're getting at is that that's what's going to happen,
right?
And it's a matter of when, not if.
If we're willing to live with the growing likelihood of catastrophic climate change, shouldn't we also be willing to look at everything that we could possibly do, every means to prevent it? I mean, there can be no more special interests. Climate change threatens every single person on the planet. And when you talk to people about that, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it's impractical, or it goes against our nature, as if catastrophic climate change is practical, or as if human beings only have one nature to them. But we're clearly surrounded historically by changes that we have the capacity to change. And I was talking to somebody else about this. At one time there used to be slavery. For the most part, that's gone. One time there used to be the divine right of kings. For the most part, that's gone. Mm-hmm. Women for millennia were treated as property or second-class citizens. For the most part, that's gone. And one example I wanted to bring up today was in the 70s and 80s, we realized the ozone was being depleted due to chlorofluorocarbons being released by refrigerants and aerosols into the atmosphere. The world came together in Montreal and signed the Montreal Protocol, and now it's on the mend. So we do have the capacity to take action and change, but historically I feel like it takes us a long time to catch on. And unfortunately, we don't have that luxury anymore. We're desperately short on time.
Part of it, too, that seems like a really big issue is an obvious issue, which is the politics of it.
Right.
I remember growing up, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and back then it was the Save the Whales stickers, I Break for Animals. I was very drawn to a lot of these conservation efforts. There was the Indian with the tear commercial, with the garbage and things like that. And like you were saying, Jeff, about the ways that these things can change, they seem to backtrack as well. Like, thinking about how NASA and the NOAA, how some of those websites were scrubbed a little bit of information about climate change recently. I think that's one of the biggest issues right now, especially in this country, is having such a political divide where someone who's more conservative might be like, oh, they'll have the Pave the Rainforest sticker, and someone more liberal, Save the Rainforest. And it's turning these things into such a political issue to the point where nothing gets done, because it's like, oh, well,
But now it's tied to some sort of party slogan or some sort of...
It becomes divisive in and of itself.
Yeah, this belief system where, it's a... Right, I think that those clips there were kind of explaining it as something greater than that. And, Neil deGrasse Tyson, as he is capable of doing, simplifies it and says, it's just science, right? Like, it's just, that's how it works. That's how the Earth works. And it's how it functions, and you are causing it to function, right? You're adding these elements to it that are making it happen more rapidly. All right, let's just stop having the conversation of if it's happening or not, because it's heating up.
Exactly.
And I think we'll get into this a little later, potentially, but you talk about the degrees of heating up. Okay, so 1.5, 2, 4, whatever, it all sounds like kind of, you might not understand that, right? You might be ignorant to that. What you really, I think, need to understand is that, I think what we need to understand, right, globally, is that is happening at a higher rate than it's ever happened, right? And they've measured that. That is understood, and that's something that the Earth really has never seen. We've never seen the Earth when this has happened.
Right.
So, are we willing to gamble with that? Because that's what it comes down to. When you start to make parties out of this, you're starting to say, well, I'm willing to gamble with that versus I'm willing not to, or it starts to become like common sense. Like, why are you even willing to take that chance?
Yeah. And, when my reading on this was in the late 80s, and this kind of speaks to the politics of it, how that came into play, was in the late 80s, they did a poll, and more Americans were in agreement then that, okay, the greenhouse effect is occurring, the planet is warming up. What happened was, and, Mobil Exxon Mobil, whichever one, they had their own scientists. And you can look this up. They had their own scientists in the 70s look into it. And they came back and said, yeah, this is, if you burn fossil fuels, you're releasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you're warming up the planet. And Exxon said, well, go back and do some more research. And what they came back and they had the same data. So what they did, is they borrowed a page from tobacco's sort of marketing. Remember in the 60s and 70s when cigarettes are bad, they started to plant the seeds of doubt. Where they took out ads in newspapers. The ads that look like it's a legitimate story, but it's actually ad unless you read the little, and then slowly it did become more politicized. And it's unfortunate. And I look at like the ozone layer issue that was going on. What's interesting and why that was successful was because regardless of party, everyone started on the same baseline. The science said this is happening. They didn't challenge the science.
There's no agenda.
Right, they weren't arguing it. The argument came into, well, how do we address it? One side said, well, what if we provide incentives for people to come off it? The other side, no, we should ban it. And they kind of met in the middle and they figured it out. But they started from baseline. Now we can't even start from the same baseline.
That's a fair point, I think, to say, I don't mind having arguments or debate about how you fix the problem. Right? Not always super helpful either, but let's at least get to that point where we're having the same conversation, right? And that's what you're kind of saying.
I have a list here of 5 pages, and I'll actually pull it out, since we touched on this. 5 pages of science organizations from across the world, single space, of all these different ones, scientific consensus that climate change is happening due to the burning of fossil fuels. This just goes on and on page. You start out with NASA, okay, right. And then the Geological Society of America, the Academies of Science of France, and it goes on and on and on all the way to Bulgaria. It's just endless. So they've done a good job of creating the doubt, and unfortunately, the reasoning behind it is. It's greed,
Yeah, I think it is.
I have another clip on deforestation and the ice melt in the Arctic. Let's take a look at this next clip, and then we'll go from there.
Greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, and the problem is getting harder to solve.
The main driver of climate change is greenhouse gas emissions. Forests are one of our ways out. They are like the lungs of the planet. They are big climate regulators at a global scale. These warm orangey tones, that's forest disturbance. That means forest was removed. We didn't know that was going on. Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, Bolivia, we can go anywhere and see actual forests be cleared. It usually starts with logging. Rainforests are cleared and burned. They then replace it with soybeans, rubber, pasture for cattle. But one of the big drivers is palm oil. Palm oil is like a magical fruit. We all have palm oil in our houses right now.
It's found in almost every good you can think about. It's in soaps, it's in shampoo, it's in chocolate, it's in bread, it's even in crisps. What we're doing accidentally and inadvertently is actually causing deforestation in other countries because our demand for this product.
When you look at our maps, our results are showing that it's accelerating. It almost looks like a contagion. You know, it looks like a disease across the planet. I mean, the ever-increasing pattern.
Trees are now being cut down and burnt at such a rate that nearly a third of our carbon dioxide emissions are caused by deforestation.
It sucks. I'm a pretty lighthearted, optimistic guy, but just looking at these data, you just looking at the stories, it's like, I'd like to see some evidence of really strong kind of unified political response that was more than an aspiration on a kind of piece of paper, right? That would be cool.
Earth's ice, frozen for millennia, is melting.
Earth's temperature has risen by what most people would think is a small amount over the past century, about 1 degree centigrade, and that's too much for Earth's ice to withstand. In the last year, we've had a global assessment of ice losses from Antarctica and from Greenland, and they tell us that things are worse than we'd expected. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. It's lost 4 trillion tons of ice, and it's losing 5 times as much ice today as it was 25 years ago. If you go to the southern hemisphere, Antarctica is losing 3 times as much ice today as it was 25 years ago. In Antarctica, really small changes in ocean temperature in particular melt a lot of ice. The ocean is only about 0.5 degree centigrade warmer than it should be. But that's melting colossal amounts of ice from enormous glaciers.
Okay, so...
More sobering content.
It is more sobering. And I just wanted to, this is an article that was recently in most of the media out there. So they take measurements of the atmosphere on something called the Keeling curve. It was Charles David Keeling started doing this, and they do it at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, where they've been keeping track of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And they do it in parts per million. So when we started, right before the Industrial Revolution, it was estimated that we were at about 270 parts per million. As of June this year, June 2019, it was the first time they've ever measured 414 parts per million. And that's sort of like, that's extremely alarming. And they have a graph here, and you can see the trend is just, it's just clear as day. It's going up. It's going up about 3 parts per million a year. Right. And another climate scientist, her name is Joelle Gurgis. She's from Australia. She had an article in the Monthly in August, and she says even for scientists, this is so depressing for them, and how to communicate this to the public, like, pay attention. This is bad. And she says that we are likely to reach, now we're at 414 parts per million in the summer. She says we are likely to reach 560 parts per million around 2060. She said this will cause the temperatures to raise between 2.8 and 5.8 degrees Celsius of warming. Incredibly, at least 8 of the latest models produced by leading research centers in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and France show climate sensitivity at 5 degrees Celsius or warmer. So right now, for instance, with the Paris Agreement, they're just trying to, like, let's just keep it at 1.5.
Like grow every year.
Right. Let's not go higher than that. Well, right now, if we just business as usual,
you'll be at 5 degrees.
Right.
In what, 40 years?
Right.
Which,
and if that happens, we're gone. I don't think people comprehend that. We're gone.
Yeah.
Because you lose your agriculture.
Well, you know, for me, that's like when I'm supposed to be retiring.
Right.
So that's going to be right out the window.
But no, that 401k business?
Yeah, you know, when you don't have enough crops to feed people.
Right.
And Australia's turned into Mad Max.
And it's already happening.
Trouble.
They had every day there's something in the paper now that's just screaming that we need to do something about this. The U.S. Department of Agriculture. This was on August 17th, so this was just last week. Said this was the worst planting season on record due to adverse weather events. It prevented more than 19.4 million acres of crops from being planted across the country, and most significantly in the Midwest, which saw the sharpest decline in corn and wheat, and soybean. So it's already happening. You know, this is a bad year. No, this is the worst that it's ever happened. And so I feel like all these things are going to start gradually start mounting up.
Yeah, and you think like in some ways it's like they seem fractured, separate, right? But in the end, actually, it really is all back to this major problem. And I thought both those articles you brought up, well, first, you know, that scale, right, and the way to measure that and to understand, right, there's always carbon in the atmosphere. But now it's at such a dramatic, you know, range that even the natural breathing of the earth, right, I think that's how they explained it.
Right.
It's like kind of, right, it breathes in carbon, right, when all the trees kind of grow, and then it breathes it out when they all kind of like go to rest in the winter, right?
Right.
That level is still at such a high level on average that you're just completely out of the norm. And that woman's, I guess it was, you know, her article there was really interesting from a, like, you know, like you said, in this time frame, like in this timeline, like this lifetime.
This lifetime.
You're going to have.
This isn't some fantasy,
change,
like, a million years from now we may, whatever.
No, you're talking like 5 degrees difference. Could be like one summer, it's, remember that summer where it was nice, like really hot, and then the next year, like, people are dying because it's dramatically more, like, hot.
And we're seeing that now in Europe.
Like,
right. So these things start, ratcheting up.
Yeah, and science-wise, I think for me, as I was reading the articles that you shared, the thing that really hits home is, and the way to, because we talk about the parts per million and graphs and things, which visually make sense. It's getting worse. When you think about it in this very practical way of, okay, so if it's too warm, the glaciers will melt, Greenland, Arctic, Antarctica. And when that happens, that also then makes for less of an area that is white.
Right.
So the thing about the color is that the white is what reflects the heat back out, where the darker colors, like of the ocean, are what absorb it. So not only is the melting making the water higher, and that's why there'll be a significant amount of coastline disappearing, but it's also that whole positive feedback loop. One thing is the iceberg melts, or the ice on Greenland melts, then makes the water higher, and then there's less of that white area to reflect back, so it's just going to keep getting warmer and warmer, and that's something that really hit home.
You're just speeding it up, because now you have less white reflecting the sunlight back.
Exactly.
The oceans are absorbing the heat. Right. The heat in the ocean is melting more icebergs. And then you just can't.
And there's no way, it's not like more ice is going to grow in the Arctic or Antarctica, unless there were some kind of event that happened where it got really cold for a long time.
And this summer, particularly in Greenland, this is, I know that I'm just full of articles today, but I'm just trying to...
It's helpful to kind of have context here.
This is from the Anchorage Daily News. Alaska is probably very concerned about things. But this was, it's an AP report that they took information from, Associated Press report. But in July alone, Greenland ice sheets poured 197 billion tons of water into the North Atlantic, which was enough to raise sea levels by 0.5 millimeter in 1 month time. On August 1st, Greenland had its biggest single-day melt event on record, with 12.5 billion tons of surface ice lost to the sea.
Right, and another part of that too is what I was talking about earlier about the white and reflecting and the dark of the ocean absorbing. What's happening too is that this permafrost melt is really scary. That's sort of the unknown, because we can look at having a cut down fossil fuels, do like the best possible marketing campaign we could think of, get all the countries in the world, be like, yes, we have to do this now. But with this cycle, this positive feedback loop, the fact that this permafrost itself releases methane and carbon.
Which is like 34 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
That's a really scary thing.
I think there was one thing you had, article you sent us, where it said there was like 4 major things, right? It was like, glaciers melting, permafrost, deforestation, and then I forget the one other. Oh, it was a death of oxygen-producing plankton.
Which is that's the building of. I mean, you knock out plankton, that's it.
Yeah. So there's 4, right? And then I really started thinking, okay, so you can check the boxes. Like, it's sad, right? It's deforestation, check. Yeah. Right? Melting of glaciers and water level rises, check. Now you're on to the last 2.
Permafrost.
And while they might be theoretical and we don't really know what they're going to mean, they believe that that's going to, right, those are the next 2 major shoes to drop. Well, the other 2 have already happened. What makes you think that the other, right?
Well, the permafrost is melting. So
that's true.
For thousands and thousands of years, you have glaciers over the land in the Arctic areas, Greenland and Alaska. And buried under that ice, way down deep, is old dirt and twigs and organic life that's just sort of been preserved there all this time. Now with the glacier melting, so is that soil coming up to life, and there's all this methane gas in that soil that's finally being released into the atmosphere because there's no more ice cover. And if that continues, I think, and this is where they talk about tipping points, that's where you reach a tipping point, a point of no return. Right. And no matter what we do, then we can't fix it. And that's something that's you hear in the news a lot. We have 10 years. We have so much time, and I actually think it's a little bit less. But we have to start to get the wheels turning because there's probably things that we don't foresee now that are going to happen, but we just haven't gotten there yet. It's sort of waiting in the wings as a result of all this. And you speak to science where they can tell how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere in the past. They go to Antarctica and they take deep ice cores and they pull them up and they take samples. Further down you go into these long sort of cylinder cores, you can see how it was, 5,000 years ago, 10,000, and so on and so forth. Never, and I think it's been like 3 million years or something of that.
That's the number they put out there.
Right.
Yeah.
That we have not been at this sort of level that we are seeing now.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was hopefully getting to earlier, but it's like, that's it. That's what it is, right? Those ice core samples tell you, yes, the Earth has seen warming before, but it's never been at this scale.
Right.
And then you're measuring things like human, carbon parts per million, and you say, oh, well, volcanoes or what have you, but then you say, nope, those actually have their own measurement, right? We can measure those out.
We can tell the difference with the atoms.
Now you see, here's the carbon parts per million we think related to this thing, and fossil fuel emissions,
right?
And it starts to become pretty apparent, But I do think, along with fossil fuel emissions, right, that deforestation is a major part of it. I think the guy in the video
I'm glad we come back to that. Yeah,
it's also carbon emissions because you're burning it down. But
it's like insult to injury.
But at the same time, like, that part breaks my heart because I'm like, right, I like hiking, I like nature a lot. And just to think of those like very fragile places being basically destroyed for more humans to like have more space and, you know, use it is just, it's not depressing. It's just like, it's fixable, you know, it's something that we don't have to do that, you know, we just have to be conscious of what we choose to do and what we don't do.
The fact that they talk about the forest as being the lungs of the earth, I think that's a really good visual for just the simplest way of realizing this is a problem. You know, the lungs of the earth are actually burning and, you know, being taken down. And then with sea level rise, that means that there will be more people that live on the coasts that will have to move inland, which would mean cutting down more forests. So it's
there's a feedback loop
of a
different nature.
Yes, indeed.
Than just the Earth's actual loop.
And I am a very optimistic person in life, and I still have hope. I know that what we're talking about, it's daunting. But it's more that just realizing this really does impact everybody. And you can see it even on, there's this path I love to walk on in Barrington, 100 Acre Cove, and they've closed that path completely because the sea level has already risen to the point where it's not going to be opened up again. So little things like that, anyone who's watching or listening to this, just seeing those everyday things that are changing and realizing, you know, this is very serious and we need to do in whatever we can in our own way to become more involved with this.
Let's take a look at this next clip just because I'm looking at the time. This goes into sort of geoengineering and where it takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then let's take our conversation into that realm afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, let's take a look.
Christoph Gebalt and Jan Wutzbacher were PhD students when they decided to form a world-changing company. Tonight, they're celebrating Climeworks' 9th anniversary.
So we're still not making money. So, of course, money is not the motivation. The motivation is solving a big challenge. And there is probably as little as challenging as climate change.
Their solution is building giant fans that draw in air and bind carbon molecules onto filters. The carbon-free air is released back into the atmosphere. The CO2 is superheated and collected as gas.
I like to call it low-tech, not high-tech. It is actually very simple. The challenging part is making it work and making it cheap.
But in this developmental stage, removing just 1 ton of carbon costs an uneconomical $600 US.
We are confident that in the next 2 to 3 years, we will halve our cost to in the range of $200 to $300 per ton. And in the mid to long term, and that's for us 2025 to 2030, we see costs as $100 as feasible.
So, the big question is, what do you do with all this captured CO2? Well, fortunately, in this case, there's a greenhouse just 300 meters away. So after the carbon's sucked in to the fans, it's piped underground to the greenhouse and turned into veggies.
All right, so there's an example of some science ingenuity to try to help. It's clearly not going to be enough, but it's one facet.
Yeah, and I think what I really think you gave us an article too on some of the things they're doing in Los Angeles,
right?
Around changing their grid over to
solar and giant batteries,
yeah,
more sophisticated.
Yep, and both things what I took away from that is that gentleman there was talking about kind of scale, right?
Right.
How do I get this to scale? Cost is usually solved by getting things up to a larger scale. So that's what their challenge is at this point. But it's really cool to see them, right? He said low tech, but basically they're just making farms, underground or whatever. That's really cool. And then, reading the article on the Los Angeles County, I don't even know if it was Los Angeles County, but
it was. Los Angeles County approved a deal where they're going to have a huge solar farm. This is from July of this year, backed by one of the world's largest battery. 7% of the city's electricity, beginning in 2023, will come from solar power. I mean, it's a start. It's something.
Yeah, and it's really, to me, what's really cool about it is that you have something that works. So you say, okay, we have solar, and then we have these backup batteries. They're going to cost a lot, but if we did this the more you add to that grid, the easier it's going to get. Hopefully I'm not obscuring the point here, but then you also get that government regulation piece, right? Where if we incentivize that and we keep the prices down so it's the same as if you used gas, it suddenly becomes a lot easier for everybody to do it.
Right.
And then the economy of scale works and everybody's doing it. That gives me hope, right? We talk about optimism.
Yeah.
It's a very serious problem. But these are things that are happening once you start getting them. Maybe, right, in 5 years, we're sitting here saying, Massachusetts or Rhode Island is going 100, whether it's Boston or Providence, right? Like maybe they're going 100% solar or wind, right? Being off the coast, and
Rhode Island's already starting to do that.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really cool I'm hopeful for that, to solve the problem.
And hopefully on this side of things, we can get a positive feedback loop.
Right.
Because once you start that ball rolling, they're also doing it in Iceland. This was Sweden. Or Switzerland, Switzerland, that we just saw the clip on. I saw also another clip where they were doing the same thing, carbon extraction, in Iceland, where they're turning it into rock. They're putting it down to a certain soil where it has a chemical process where it turns into rock. That's fantastic. It's one little plant, but it's the beginning. The key is, though, if you have their facility, the clip we just saw, or the one in Iceland, burning fossil fuel to extract it in their fans, then we're sort of defeating the purpose. So you need wind energy, you need solar on the grid, so we get ahead of this thing. So if we, it's going to take this kind of carbon extraction with all the other list of things that need to be done. There's not one answer to this. It's going to take so many things. Definitely. But I didn't want to put out there like, oh, this is all gloom and doom. These examples, what's going on in LA, these carbon extractions, we're just, if we put our minds to it, we can do this. And I have a clip that has some good news of things that happened in 2018 to sort of address climate change, to sort of, we can do this.
Right.
Let's take a look. Okay, so there's some good news. So in my research, I wrote down actions needed, and this isn't my brilliant thoughts. It was a combination of different scientists and so forth saying what actions needed. Obviously, we started to take action. There's some good news in that clip, but this is what I came up with from reading. Mm-hmm. Number one, there's 4 things. Get off fossil fuels. We have to get off. And we have to start transitioning. I mean, seriously transitioning off. And at the very least, you make everything more fuel efficient in the short term. 2 was investment and implementation of carbon-free energy resources, such as solar power, wind. Solar power, and it was one of the articles, we get enough energy from the sun, they said, in one day to power our civilization for the whole year. In one day. Number 3, and I know you'll both disagree with me on this, but reforestation on a grand scale. I'm sorry, that's the way I feel. No.
Is that that's what you're running on?
If you can picture, like everybody planting trees, how many people are there in the world? Even if they planted 1, what are we up to? 6?
7, 8 billion?
7 or 8 billion. Somewhere in there.
So just right there, and that gets back to that idea of just on a small scale, people working as community, as human beings, to try with these little things and not giving up on, well, this is too big a problem, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Right.
I'm going to carpe diem my way into just having a good time until the earth doesn't exist anymore. Probably not the best route to take.
You're so right on. I sometimes talk to people who say, well, that's not going to, I'm in my 60s, so why should I care? I'm like, wow, what kind of mean-spirited, I mean, do you not have children? Do you not have grandchildren? And even if you don't, do you not have friends who have brothers and sisters who have children? How can you even, I think they're being sort of.
Yeah, and I think, you made me think of it as, like, even if you did a grand scale for reforestation effort, like, isn't it just feel good, like, the same way, like, donating to people in need is? Like, wouldn't it just feel good to know that, like, I did this, and whether it was 20 years from now or 200 years from now, there's going to be people looking at this forest that we put together, like, that we grew, that like, humans grew, because it was protecting the planet. Like, that's a good that's going to be a good feeling. It's very long term, but like, yeah, like, how could you possibly be so short-sighted to think that's not the same as, like, donating to cancer research or, like, helping those in need?
You want to live forever? Remain, be in people's thoughts of the things that you did during your lifetime that made a difference. That's how you live. You live on in the memories of others.
Right.
And you come right to something else. Number 4, help bring the poorest populations on the planet to self-sufficiency, which is key to curbing world population. Right. I know we're almost out of time. I have one last clip that I wanted to show. This clip's kind of interesting. Planetary scientists will tell you that at one time, long ago, Venus most likely had seas, oceans, and it was a lot more of a clement sort of planet to live on, but something went wrong. What went wrong is Venus now has a runaway greenhouse effect. Nobody's suggesting that there were people there driving gas guzzlers, but Mother Nature can do damage to a planet. But I think the key there is we need not force the hand of nature.
Very fair.
So this next clip shows Venus in comparison with a runaway greenhouse effect. And at the end of the clip, scientist Carl Sagan, who even then they were discussing climate change, was saying we as a planet face a critical branch point, and he kind of lays it out in this clip. And I think it's a good way to end this program. Let's take a look.
From a distance, our sister planet seems serene and peaceful, its clouds motionless. These clouds are near the top of a great ocean of air, about 100 kilometers thick, composed mainly of carbon dioxide. Even in the high clouds, Venus is a thoroughly nasty place. Beneath the clouds, in the dense, clear air, it's about as bright as on an overcast day on Earth. But the atmosphere is so thick that the ground seems to ripple and distort. The atmospheric pressure down here is 90 times that on Earth. The temperature is 380 degrees centigrade, 900 Fahrenheit, hotter than the hottest household oven. This is a world marked by searing heat, crushing pressures, sulfurous gases, and a desolate, reddish landscape. Venus is the one place in the solar system most like hell. The reason Venus is like hell seems to be what's called the greenhouse effect. Ordinary visible sunlight penetrates the clouds and heats the surface, but the dense atmosphere blankets the surface and prevents it from cooling off to space. The hell of Venus is in stark contrast with the comparative heaven of its neighboring world, our little planetary home, the Earth. Here, the atmosphere is 90 times thinner. Here, the carbon dioxide and water vapor make a modest greenhouse effect, which heats the ground above the freezing point of water. Without it, our oceans would be frozen solid. A little greenhouse effect is a good thing. But Venus is an ominous reminder that on a world rather like the Earth, things can go wrong. There is no guarantee that our planet will always be so hospitable. To maintain this clement world, we must understand it and appreciate it. And our small planet, at this moment, here we face a critical branch point in history. What we do with our world right now will propagate down through the centuries and powerfully affect the destiny of our descendants. It is well within our power to destroy our civilization and perhaps our species as well. If we capitulate to superstition or greed or stupidity, we can plunge our world into a darkness deeper than the time between the collapse of classical civilization and the Italian Renaissance. But we are also capable of using our compassion and our intelligence, our technology and our wealth to make an abundant and meaningful life for every inhabitant of this planet, to enhance enormously our understanding of the universe and to carry us to the stars.
Okay, critical branch point. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess Carl will probably say it better than I did. Already said it better than I will. But I think, I guess some closing thoughts for myself were similar. You put your list together. I watched a documentary this year, right, about the moon landing on PBS.
Yeah.
And 50-year anniversary.
Oh, I saw that too.
Yeah, it was really cool. So then I watched, next I started catching Nova every week, right? So the next one's about the Cassini probe going to Saturn.
Oh, I saw that. That was great.
And checking out, finding, liquid ocean on one of the moons and better understanding of the whole entire, right, Saturn kind of cosmosphere.
Yeah.
Then the next week it was about New Horizon, checking out Pluto. And going even further, they weren't, I forget, this Kuiper Belt, right?
Yep.
Out into the Kuiper Belt. And they didn't have a target, but they found a target and they took a picture of it, and they got it right. And that stuff's possible because we're here on Earth. And this is kind of what Sagan always said, right? We're here on Earth. This is our little spaceship, right? Okay. Out to the cosmos. And I want to see more of that stuff. It took them 15 years for the New Horizon, probably more, I think, but it was at least 15 years. They launched it. I remember hearing about a launch, and then it wasn't even until like 2015, 2016 that they even got to Pluto, Right. And that stuff takes time, but you also have to protect what you have here. And some of the things we talked about they sound so dire or dramatic and so small, like humans, we need to fix this problem. But really, you're talking about a bigger thing, right? The Earth is your spaceship, and you need to take care of it and tend the garden here too. So if that's, that to me is enough of a call. That's enough of a perspective for me to like understand what needs to get done. I hope that's how other people see it too.
And then the technological side of things, what you're speaking to, the fact that Cassini went out and we went to the moon, and we have all of this technology that's been developed that allowed us to do things that we probably didn't think were possible at some point, and then all of a sudden we're flying, and we're flying out of our atmosphere into space, and taking that technology also as a sign of hope for, wow, look what we as human beings have been able to do and create. Let's take that, like you said, on our spaceship, take that sort of innovation, like some of the clips that we saw earlier, and just let's put some funding towards that and amp that up a little more.
These are very. Another thing about that point that you're making is by learning about these other worlds, we learn more about our own. And the Venus clip was a perfect example. We see that things can go wrong. And we also see that there are currently no other places to go. But it shows that we have the capacity to do great things. We have to get off our duff, and we have to do it. We can.
Right. Yeah. And it's going to take a commitment, and it's worth it. Right.
It's great to be alive.
Yes,
we have a beautiful day today here in Rhode Island, and I woke up today and I said it's nice to be alive, breathe this fresh air. This is something to cherish and take care of. Well, thank you both for being on this program. I really appreciate your thoughts. And thank you for watching. Normally at the end of our programs, I always say that we hope that next time singer Rick Astley would join us. Given the seriousness of today's topic, well, you know what? We hope that next time singer Rick Astley will join us on our program. Thank you. Cheers.
It sucks. I try to be optimistic, but I just look at the data and I can't.
The only problem with this is it's a lot of it is announced. No, I want to see it completed.
Yeah. And we'll pick this up in 2023. We'll see where.
This is like fires and flames around us. So,
it's like we're in t-shirts.
Talking through our masks.
Karen, step out of the freezer and address. You're in a spacesuit.